The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
All right, well, coming up on this edition of today's Verdict, gerrymandering is a process in which congressional districts change frequently based on the population. That's a nice way of saying politicians manipulate districts so they can be reelected. It's a topic you will absolutely want to learn more about. Later, you ask for a specific topic, and we deliver as we tackle the ins and outs of Medicaid fraud. As you can see, we have much to get to, so stay tuned. Today's Verdict starts right now. Hello and welcome to today's Verdict, the live and interactive show that gives you your legal rights and options. I'm your host and trial attorney, David Lashwell. Today's Verdict is always encouraging you to stay connected. Make sure to tweet us at today's Verdict and hashtag Ask Today's Verdict if you have a question. Also make sure to like us and follow us on Facebook at Today's Verdict and check us out at BronxNet.tv/Bronx Legal. And last, but certainly not least, don't forget to tweet me at David Lashwell. Gerrymandering is a process that shapes districts in multiple ways. As the populations in each district changes, it becomes more uneven, which results in a district having a larger representation. This process directly affects all types of elections. Now on set to help understand the topic is attorney Brett Valacher. Hi, Brett.
So great to be here.
All right, who's Jerry, by the way? Gerrymandering. Let's talk a little bit about how we even get to this particular name, please.
So gerrymandering comes from actually a former governor of Massachusetts whose name was actually Gary.
All right.
Little known fact, his name's been mispronounced for about 200 years now.
Okay.
His name was Gary Elbridge, and he actually didn't even create the map himself. There was a state senate map that was districted shortly after his election in 1810.
All right.
That the state senate, and he signed off on it and got a lot of flack for it, as you can imagine.
Now, from what I remember from those days back in high school, the district looked like a salamander.
It did, and I actually have a slide
of it, so we'll kind of get into that. But how would you describe, really, for the lay people, what gerrymandering really is?
Sure. So gerrymandering is when a party generally redraws a electoral district in such a way that it confers itself some type of political gain.
Now, this is, in some respects, this is allowed, and it's what the founders had wanted way back when Gary or Jerry, whoever the governor was at the time, tried to redistrict. Why is that? Is it because we want to preserve the population's right to be represented? What exactly is the mindset behind it, really?
If I had to speculate, I would say it's for lack of any better system that was in place at the time. Someone had to create districts, and every 10 years you need to have a redistricting. That's baked right into Article 1 of the Constitution, where the population changes. Some states grow faster than others, so they need more Congress people to be adequately represented.
Now, I know you have some slides here, maybe do some show and tell. Any way we can get some of that, some of the slides up there? Let's take a look here.
Yeah, I'd love to. So this is actually the district where gerrymander gets its name from. This is a piece of Massachusetts, actually just above Boston, and this is the political cartoon that was created after Governor Gary Elbridge had a new districting plan drawn up, and that actually looks a little bit like a salamander.
It does look like a salamander. Now, if you take a look at this particular slide, and you see you have Andover there, you have Roxford and Rowley, how did they know who was in each particular district to be able to cut and paste and do what they needed to do? How did they know exactly how many people were in the districts? Did they actually count? Because there wasn't a census at that time. How did it really work?
So I believe that there was a census at that time. The first one being in 1800, but I'm not entirely sure about that.
But how would you know who was living on the farms and who was living in the outskirts? I guess they figured it out in some way.
I assume there was some form of exit polling.
All right.
But I'm not entirely sure.
So, you know, gerrymandering seems to give the majority who's in power an extra crack at staying in power. And I'm wondering really what's wrong with that, because don't we want to make sure that we keep some kind of fluidity in terms of our legislative leaders, or what's your opinion on that?
Sure, so that fluidity can be maintained through other ways, including by having alternating terms. So the Senate, each senator can stay in power for 6 years, but the House, for example, is supposed to be a more representative body that can fluctuate more with the will of the people. So that's why we confer them a 2-year term.
Well, let's fast forward, all right? I mean, here we are in 2006, 17. How is New York being affected by gerrymandering? I mean, do you find that there are some elections that are directly affected by recent cases involving gerrymandering?
So New York itself is actually a state that suffers from some of the least gerrymandering that I've seen, that I've actually taken a look at. So one way to measure gerrymandering is by looking at the compactness of a district, which is to look at how jagged the shape is, whether it makes any sense, whether it's contiguous, and whether it's compact, which means that it's the distance from its farthest edge is not that far from the center of it. But another way to look at it is by percentage difference between what a statewide election yields and who the entire state sends to Congress, or who it sends into its state houses and state houses.
Now, do they also look at where the post office is and where the police department is? Do they also look at those types of areas? In other words, you don't want to have two police stations in one particular district. You want to split that up. I mean, how do they use other things besides just population?
So I'm not sure that the police stations or the post offices have too much bearing on how a district actually gets drawn, but it should to some degree. People try to look at the political cohesiveness of a certain group to make sure that you're not, just splitting right down a city, a group of houses and then another group of houses, or in some instances someone's house but not actually their driveway.
Right, that'd be really ridiculous.
Right,
but
that has occurred.
It has. Now there's a racial component to this, which is really where the courts get involved. Am I correct? Tell me exactly how that works.
So that happens mostly through the Voting Rights Act, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to be specific, which is to ensure that racial minorities are not disadvantaged through any act of the state from participating in the electoral process.
Now, that's only as good as those who are filling out the census forms and puts down what ethnicity they are. Am I correct?
Not necessarily.
It's not necessarily. So, by the way, we have more slides up here.
I do, actually, yeah.
What do we have here?
So this kind of just goes into the basics of what gerrymandering is. And
Sure.
here I try to provide the most simple explanation, where you have 25 voters, and let's say that we're a state.
All right.
We want to know, we have to create 5 districts from this.
Okay.
So there are many ways that we could do this. The next slide will
Okay.
show what's known as the perfect representation,
All right.
where you have 2 to 3 red to blue voters. And so to the legislature, we'll send 2 red legislators and 3 blue legislators. That's method A.
Fine.
And then method B is where you send essentially all 5 blue legislators to the state legislature. And this one's compact. It doesn't look very gerrymandered, but people would say that it's pretty unfair because you have 40% of the populace who isn't getting any of the actual vote.
Absolutely. Well, I'm sorry.
And then the final one is method C, and that's really the topic of today, which is the gerrymandered district. And this actually, each one still has 5 voters per district, but you could see here that actually red, despite having the vast minority of voters, will send the majority of districts.
Which is
It'll be 3 to 2.
patently unfair.
Red
Now,
to blue.
if you used a computer model, could you avoid this? In other words, can you use computer programs to figure out exactly where everybody is? Can that be done as a way to maybe
Sure.
stem the tide?
Computers could actually be a double-edged sword. They could help you or hurt you, depending on what your cause is. They could allow you to really just take a perfect algorithmic sample of this is exactly where your likely voters are, this is where your likely not voters are, and basically perfect the art of gerrymandering. Or at the same time, you could create an algorithm that really is focused on compactness and fairness.
It just seems that there are so many intangibles to the topic, that you really you're never going to get it perfect. And there are so many other things that are involved because you really don't know how somebody's going to vote. I mean, you kind of do by their party affiliation, but things may change based on what school district they're in, and that has to do with where the line is drawn. What would you recommend if you were in charge of the of recreating gerrymandering and the type of law that that apply?
So I do think that redistricting is necessary. I just don't think it should be done by the people who are elected themselves. I think that the actual solution here is to come up with an independent commission, which basically sets districts based on what makes the most sense. So they would emphasize things like compactness, making sure that it's a uniform shape, making sure that you're not dividing down cities and highways. You're actually taking like as many whole cities as possible, and really just not doing it for partisan gain.
Now, but the independent commission, who you wonder who's going to be on it. Is it one Republican, one Democrat, an independent voter? Is it going to be just, I don't know, because anybody who you put on there is going to have their own feelings. If you put the PTA on there, the Parents Teachers Association, whoever it is, they're going to have a feeling. So the question is, how do you pick the independent commission? Isn't that an issue, really?
That's right. There is always a concern of what the agenda is, but I think that the most direct concern is when you have the people whose very jobs are at stake, the actual legislators, carving up maps and choosing basically which voters they want to vote for them.
Well, maybe the minority should be able to, go in there and make the decision as to how the district should be redrawn. But then again, they also have an interest also, so it's difficult. What do most of the other states do?
So most states still have state legislatures draw it up. Some states like Arizona, for example, actually has conferred their entire authority to draw these districts into an independent commission.
I know you're from Florida. What does Florida do?
Florida still puts it in the hands of legislators, unfortunately.
Where do you think we're heading in terms of New York, at least?
So New York, since 1978, has had an independent commission, but that commission doesn't actually draw the lines, it just makes recommendations to the legislature. But even that has shown to be a fruitful first step, at the very least, because New York, if you look at many measures, including the percentage measure and the shape measure, has moved towards less and less gerrymandering since 78.
It has. All right, well, Brett, we have some contact information. Tell us a little about where you're from, your firm, a little bit.
Sure. So I'm originally from Florida,
okay.
Which is why I have a lot of interest in my home state.
There we go.
Which is
5th Congressional District.
Which is one of the most gerrymandered districts in the entire country. And I currently work at Boyschiller and Flexner here in New York.
All right, wonderful. You can come back maybe in the next 6 months and see where New York stands with gerrymandering.
I would love to.
All right, we have to take a quick break, but don't worry, we'll be back with more Today's Verdict right after this.
It's not always easy being a dad.
Do you have panda asthma too? Does that run in the family?
This is the home of the most priceless kung fu artifacts.
But when you make an effort,
Dad, we're not supposed to touch anything. Oh, sorry.
Go along, son!
it's always worth it.
Whoa, master!
The smallest moments can have the biggest impact on a child's life. Take time to be a dad today.
I am gonna get you. I'm gonna get you.
Call 877-4DAD-411 or visit fatherhood.gov to learn more.
Take a look under your bed. Find stuff under there? What about jobs? No? Now try your closet. Still no jobs? Just more stuff? Well, you really have both. See, stuff is defined as household articles considered as a group. Sometimes this stuff is no longer needed. Wait, no longer needed? That can't be right. Because remember those jobs you were looking for? Those are really needed. And they're the stuff inside your stuff. Our job is to unlock those jobs. And it starts when you donate your stuff to your local Goodwill. Here's how we do it. When you donate to Goodwill, we sell your stuff to provide job training for people right here in your community. So just by teaming up with Goodwill, you help create jobs. And isn't that worth parting with the leftover keytar from your 80s cover band? Goodwill. Donate stuff, create jobs.
It's me, Artie. Come see what I collected from the Creative Galaxy in my idea box.
Transform your world.
Will you help me make art?
Before you throw it away,
Hey, I have an idea.
think outside the box.
Go be amazing!
Give your cardboard box another life. Recycle.
Your daughter just had her first breakup. Do you A, put yourself in her shoes, B, console her,
Don't worry, sweetie. This is gonna happen a lot.
or C, find her a new boyfriend?
Nice single boys. That was weird.
As a parent, there are no perfect answers. But you don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent. Thousands of teens in foster care will love you just the same.
Welcome back to Today's Verdict. I'm your host, David Lesh. We are always encouraging you to stay connected. Tweet us at Today's Verdict. Well, Medicaid is a health insurance program that provides medical help for people with low income. But unfortunately, many people manipulate the system and take advantage of this program. Many do not have low income and should not qualify. This results in Medicaid fraud, a crime that affects all of us. Well, joining us today to discuss this topic is criminal law attorney Todd Spodek. Todd, thanks for being here, first of all.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Let's just start from the very beginning.
Sure.
When we say Medicaid, what do we mean by Medicaid?
Sure. So in reality, Medicaid is just a organization that is a conduit for health insurance for indigent people. It's not actually a healthcare company. It's really a middleman, which is arranging for private insurance companies to give health insurance.
Right. And I assume if somebody meets the criteria and they don't have the means, they will put an application in for Medicaid, right?
Absolutely. So what happens is you fill out an application, you detail who lives in your household, the family size, your income, and potentially your resources. You submit it. The benefits start immediately upon them accepting your application.
Now, that initial application, do you have to provide proof of exactly what's in the bank? Do you own a car? Do you own a home? Is your wife working? Like, what exactly are they asking for?
No, most of the time you're just swearing to it. It's a self-swearing application. So under penalty of perjury, everything you say is true, but also you can't omit things either. So you can't have $100,000 in the bank account and omit to mention that.
Do they search for these things?
No,
they
not
don't.
up front.
All right, so that starts with the process of a
Correct.
possible Medicaid fraud.
Absolutely.
Right. Now, when you're swearing to this, swearing under penalties of perjury, so the viewers understand, what does it mean when you're swearing to something?
Right, so you're signing this application and you're swearing under penalty of perjury. You're taking an oath that everything is true and accurate as of the date of that application. And that's going to allow the organization, whether it be HRA or some other organization, to determine your eligibility. So if you say you make $10,000 a year, they're believing at face value you make $10,000 a year. If you fail to admit that you have a side job as a bartender or a housekeeper and you have cash or something along those lines, they don't know it and you're not being straightforward, the benefits would be fraudulent.
Okay, now you as a criminal defense attorney, you represent a gamut of individuals who end up being accused of Medicaid fraud, am I correct?
That's absolutely correct.
Give me like the example of the type of
Sure.
people
So we represent a lot of people who are recipients who apply for benefits and then are either investigated by HRA for fraud or criminally prosecuted by the DA's office for fraud. We also, on the other side of that, represent doctors who are involved in Medicaid fraud, such as illegal kickbacks or overbilling or bundling services. And unfortunately, healthcare fraud is such a large area, there's really an endless amount of these scenarios.
The Bronx, where we are right now
Sure.
filming, what's going on here?
So we have a lot of cases in the Bronx. We have a lot of individuals who own property with family members. So traditionally, you own a piece of property and you're on the deed, you're on the mortgage. But in certain immigrant communities in the Bronx, 10 people may own a property even though one person's on the deed, and they all may contribute the money, and it all may be cash because they're new immigrants, they don't know the system, they don't know everything about it.
And what happens is
Right,
so explain to me what happens
sure,
next.
Sure. So what happens a lot of times is someone will apply for benefits and say, I have nothing, basically. You know, I don't have any obligations to anyone, I don't receive any money from anyone, I don't own anything, and claim poverty. But in reality, there is either operating agreement somewhere that details taxes paid by them, or they're paying rent, but in reality it's towards the mortgage, which
Sure.
is a property they own, or their spouse, who's not their legal husband or wife, owns the property. So there's like creative scams.
Now, sometimes it's not necessarily an intentional fraud.
Absolutely.
You know, maybe you get married and now you own joint property, or there's some
Absolutely.
issues. But it's your obligation to make sure you keep Medicaid aware of what's going on with your assets. Am I correct?
100%. You have an affirmative obligation to update them as things change.
So they don't have to. So you don't have to wait for them to contact you. You have to contact them.
Correct. But they will send you a recertification,
They
which
will.
also obligates you to let them know
How
changes.
often does that come?
Annually.
Annually.
Yes.
And again, you're swearing to the same thing. All right. So now, by the way, who is HRA? Just so.
So HRA is New York City's Human Resources Administration. It's a organization under New York City that deals with social services and all types of scenarios with social services. What we're referring to is the fraud investigations, but they're also dealing with other Medicaid issues not fraud related.
Now, you get this letter from HRA, and it says, guess what? We think there may be some fraud. What's in that letter exactly?
Sure. So by the time a recipient gets that letter, an investigation's been done already. Keep in mind, you bump into New York City one way or the other. Driver's license, property records, insurance, your kids are in school. There's always some record somewhere which will come back to haunt you.
You can't be completely off the grid in New York City.
Correct, you can't. So by the time you receive that letter, they've done an investigation. They may have done a field investigation, come to your house, take photos, interview your neighbors, find out where your kids go to school. So it's a problem already. Sometimes it's a manageable problem that could be resolved with HRA, and other times it's going to get referred for prosecution.
Does the letter actually tell you the specifics of the fraud that you've allegedly committed, whether you're the doctor, whether you're the individual, or is it just a form that says you may be in trouble, come into the office, we want to talk?
The letter will say what the issue is. We believe there's been an overpayment due to non-reported income or due to household members that were not included in your application.
And what do they ask you to do?
So
Come on down, right?
Yeah, so what they'll do is they'll detail evidence that should trigger an immediate concern, meaning they'll say, please come to a meeting and bring your deed, your mortgage statement, proof that you live in New York City, or something to trigger, you know what, there's an issue here. And a lot of times people think, you know what, it's not a big deal, everyone does it, it's not going to go anywhere, blah, blah, blah. And that turns into a catastrophe.
So tell me what they should do.
So the truth of the matter is, as soon as you get this letter, you should either have a lawyer contact them or you contact them and schedule a meeting at a good time. The last thing you want is to be rushed into a meeting scared, not knowing the extent of what they're talking about and not knowing your rights.
Is that meeting with HRA recorded? Is there a court reporter there? What goes on
No,
there?
so there'll be two investigators from HRA. They'll sit, they'll take notes. But it is a fraud investigation. These are not your friends.
And most people don't realize that. They go down there thinking, oh, I'll
Absolutely.
just explain it and there's no big deal. But they're building a criminal case against you already.
And you're making admissions. You're literally sitting down making admissions, stating facts that will be used against you. It's no question about it.
Who seems to be, in your opinion, because you've been doing this now, more at risk? Is it the doctors? Is it the individuals? Is it a little bit both? Where is New York really grabbing?
I would say the recipient fraud in New York City is really rampant. I think Brooklyn has the highest levels nationwide of Medicaid fraud, and they are cracking down significantly. They're sending out more and more investigators, they're hiring more investigators, and HRA has an algorithm now that will analyze records to see patterns of fraud.
Give me an example. Really.
So for example, they'll say, if you have on your application a family size of 4 and you live in a certain area, they'll be able to say how much money you would need to survive. So if you're putting on your application artificial numbers, and they could pull up any other records to support that your children are either in private school, you own a car, you're on a lease, you own a piece of property.
So if you're living in Williamsburg, let's say, and now it's a really hot community, and you're living there, and it seems like, well, how are you functioning here, you know, with only what we're giving you? It can't be.
Exactly.
They knock on your neighbor's doors and they say, who owns that car? Oh, it's my neighbor. Oh,
Right.
it is. And they start taking pictures and they build a case. What are the criminal aspects to this case?
So-
in other words, what can happen to you?
Sure. So it's obviously a financial crime. There's anywhere from probation to state prison sentences available to the DA's
Do
office.
people go to jail for this?
They do.
They
yeah,
do.
absolutely.
Okay.
It's not a crime that is prosecuted the same as violent crimes. It's obviously a little bit different, and a lot of times you have mitigating factors. So you do have immigrant families, you do have people who are new to America, new to New York, new to the benefit system, which works in resolving the cases favorably.
Now, do you continue to handle the case while it's before the district attorney at this point?
Yeah, so my firm covers all aspects of Medicaid fraud, from civil investigations with HRA to state and federal prosecutions for Medicaid fraud.
So what's the best advice you would probably give to somebody who, you know, who first signs that, first who gets the
Let's
letter?
start from the beginning.
Okay, start from the beginning, good.
Sure. So the best thing is to be forthright and to realize that your scheme, your idea of how this works, has already been done by a number of people. So they're hip to the game. It's not like you're recreating something that's new. They understand this. If you live with a spouse and they're paying your mortgage and you're going to submit a letter that says you're paying rent, this is what a lot of people do. It's very easy to see. It's a paper fraud. They could trace it. So the honest thing to do is to disclose your income and assets, and if you are of the threshold to get benefits, you'll get it, except you may have to pay part of the premium.
Okay.
So that's the best thing. Moving on, if you receive a letter and you're the target of an investigation, you should seek counsel. There's no question about it because the exposure is real. And these cases aren't a he said, she said case about a fight or something. They're documented paper trails that a DA can follow all the way. So they're strong cases to begin with.
Do you ever get a call on the phone from the investigators, or do you have to go down there?
Generally, they'll send a letter, certified mail to your house, and come to your house sometimes to hand deliver.
Oh, they may actually come to your house?
Yeah, because they want to see who answers the door. They want to see if your car is parked out there. They want to see anything that would tie you to the fraud.
The medical providers themselves, because I know this is a
Sure.
big issue, the doctors, how are they trying to get over on the system? Let's give me an example of what a doctor does.
So, for example, we've represented a number of clinics that will incentivize patients to come in and then bill them for phantom services. So, for example, you receive Medicaid. You already are at a low income threshold, so you don't have much money. If a runner from a clinic entices you to come in and says, listen, we're going to give you $200 cash, that's a lot of money to you. They'll bring you in as a patient. You may not be treated at all, and they'll bill $5,000 worth of Medicaid services.
And how do they find that out?
Well, how does the government find it
how
out?
does HRA
Because
find it out,
there's
sir?
audits. There's audits of all medical providers who receive Medicare, Medicaid, so they could see if these are particular realistic things. And again, they have algorithms to test whether this makes sense or not.
Gotcha. All right, now where do we find you, by the way?
So our main office is actually on the same block as HRA. It's 100 Church Street on the 8th floor. And then we have a satellite office in Brooklyn and Queens.
All right, and you'll come back and let us
I'd
know.
love to come back anytime.
Let us know how it's progressing in New York.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank our guests for joining us and, of course, you, the viewers, for watching. If you missed any part of today's show, be sure to check it out at www.BronxNet.tv. Also remember, if there's a legal issue or topic you'd like to see on a future edition of Today's Verdict, feel free to contact me at davidlesh@bronxnet.org or tweet us at Today's Verdict, and make sure to hashtag #AskToday'sVerdict. From myself and all of us at Today's Verdict, always remember, know your rights, know your issues, reach a verdict. We'll see you next time.
Hamilton was adopted from a rescue in 2008. He really likes to be around people. And as soon as I start to make my breakfast, Hamilton is right there. I get out my mat and I'm doing a downward dog and he's underneath. He's quite the pug about town. He gets invited to a lot of parties. He knows he's a pretty big deal. I mean, look at this little face. How could you not love him?